don't forget your costume." The crone hobbled out onto the veranda, leaning heavily on her gnarled grey walking stick. Her robes of a rich, satin black seemed somehow too new and perfect when contrasted with her sallow, wrinkled skin, long hooked nose, eyes almost invisible in the depths of their sockets, and long, pointed chin that seemed almost sharp enough to hurt. A pointed hat, perfectly matched to her robes, sat upon her head. The wisps of hair poking from beneath her hat, as sable as her clothes, contrasted starkly with her pale face. A warty dark brown toad sat still as a statue upon her shoulder, the illusion belied only by the twitching of its eyes as it looked around. "Young lady," she said in a gravelly voice, "where is your costume?" I lowered my book and looked along the pool to see her walking stick raised and pointed at me, a scowl making her hideous features even less attractive, the lines in her face looking almost deep enough to make tubes under the folds of skin. "I don't need a costume," I replied, "since I'm just going to stay here and read my book while I have a quiet night." "Quiet night or not, you don't want the spirits to find you," she said. "And they will find you if you don't put on a decent costume, mark my words." "Spirits? Humbug." I raised my book to get back to it. "They always have to learn the hard way," a new voice spoke sadly in a melodious tenor. By the end of the night, I would know what he meant, but I had been lulled into complacency by the similarities between this world and the one I had come from. "What is it with you two and your spirits?" I groused. "Be off with you to your party and leave me in peace." The end of a stick landed on the pages of my book. I looked up to see the face of the crone, a face not improved in the least by nearness. "Tonight is All Hallows' Eve," she said in that slow, gravelly voice, "and tonight the spirits have the chance to enter this world to go after those who they think wronged them in life." Somehow her eyes held me and I couldn't look away as she continued. "Even if you don't have any of those spirits to fear, there are enough who find amusement in stirring up trouble you'd rather not get involved in, that the prudent don a costume even to lie in bed." Her speech slowed as she finished, "You ignore them at your peril." Finally I could look away. I sighed wearily, and after a moment said, "That's a myth, Jen. I don't have any interest in your party or any other. There isn't any reason for me to have a costume. You enjoy your evening and leave me my quiet." Now she sighed, loudly, "You will regret forgetting your costume. Remember that if you can get to the brook you will be protected." Without another word she turned and hobbled off, followed by her manservant dressed in an elegant purple suit and top hat. Before he left he turned and said, "If you reach the brook you can follow it upstream into the house, and you will get a costume. However, you would be far better off hurrying into a costume now. The costume you will get that way cannot just be doffed when the night is over." I waved absently, my head buried in my book, as he turned away again and the two of them made their way to the car. As I heard the engine start I took a moment to watch the last sliver of sun disappear behind the low ridge in the distance. A moment later I was again buried in my book, a mistake that would cost me more than I could then have imagined. Some time later I startled when a frog jumped in my lap. With my heart pounding I looked down to see the creature, with its smooth, green skin and large protruding eyes staring up at me. It croaked loudly, and even though I saw it coming, I was off balance enough that I jumped again. Then came the cackling laughter from several voices around me. I looked up again to see the pale form hovering near the roof between me and one of the lights. Its clothes hung in tatters from its body, bordering on indecency, and I could just make out the evil grin it wore. Most unsettling of all was that the light shone through its chest and spread throughout it, illuminating it with a pale glow that didn't quite make its details clearly visible against the light behind it. It leered at me as it started to move closer. Turning, I saw 3 other various forms, all with the same glow, although with 2 of them I couldn't be sure they had the same transparency against the faintly glowing late twilight sky. All were just as grotesque as the first, and all put the crone's costume to shame for ugliness. Somehow, even through my terror, I remembered that the brook was supposed to be a safe place. With a scream caught in my throat I rolled from the reclining chair, dislodging both the frog and my book, and blindly ran for the brook behind me. Just a few feet from the brook I managed to look enough to spot yet another of the figures right in front of me, too close to avoid at my headlong pace. In the fleeting moment before I barreled into it, meeting no resistance, I noted that it was about a foot shorter than my own near 6 feet. My guts churned as my foot encountered the empty air past the bank of the brook, coming to land heavily on the sandy bottom a few feet below where my foot had expected to meet land, the rest of my body tumbling over into the chill water, the shock of it taking my breath. My clothes were soaked through to the skin by the time I hit the shallow bottom. I rolled over and raised my head above the water. The grotesque figures ranged along the brook, leering malevolently. At the sight of them I squeaked, and slipped under the water again. On surfacing again I found them still floating along the bank, but no closer than the one I had encountered a pace away from the bank. Watching them I saw that they would test getting closer, but each time pulled back as if burned. Safe. At least it seemed safe for the moment, but now that I wasn't quite scared witless I was feeling the chill of the mountain brook. No way could I stay here for long without freezing, but the spirits didn't seem to be going anywhere. If anything, there seemed to be more gathering. I looked around and saw the house, which reminded me of what George had said about the brook leading into the house. Hopefully it couldn't be worse than the situation I got in, and at least they seemed to have been trying to help me. Trying that seemed better than either alternative, since otherwise I'd either have to face the spirits or freeze, neither of which seemed like a good idea. With a nervous look above, I stood up, but thankfully the protection of the brook seemed to extend up high enough that I couldn't see any above me. With the quiet sound of water dripping off me barely audible above the gurgling of the brook I worked my way upstream towards the house. My pants clinging cold and wet hindered progress, and my shirt, while it didn't hamper travel, it was if anything colder than my pants. Sure enough, as I got close I saw an opening with a waterfall obscuring all past it and faintly illuminated by a green-tinged glow. I hesitated a moment, but the spirits still prowled the bank, and I was losing feeling in my fingers and toes. With nothing useful behind me and the sides closed off I took a deep breath of the cool evening air and forced one foot in front of the other through the curtain of water into the unknown. Chapter 2. I emerged into what might almost have been another world. The brook cascaded down a switchback channel that made one side of an angled shaft I figured must lead up under the house. It appeared the light came from the top, obscured and filtered to a green color by the plants running riot through the shaft to the point where I could see only a few feet over my head. Though I might have liked to stay and look, as cold as I already was, that wasn't a good idea when I didn't know how long it would be before I could get warmed up. I turned back for a moment and, to my great relief, saw no sign of the spirits that had driven me here. The cascade that allowed the water to flow almost silently down such a steep slope as the shaft I was in looked like it could be used as a ladder. I grabbed hold of the edge of the lowest trough-like rock and pulled experimentally. My numb fingers weren't as sensitive as I would have liked, but it felt solid, so I hung on and walked up the wall underneath. Somewhat inelegantly I managed to get crouched on the trough and looked up at the dense plants just above my head. Most of the plants looked like familiar ones I could name, but somehow they looked changed. Leaf vein patterns that seemed different, proportions just a little off, or colors just not quite right. Somehow the effect still became a harmonious whole, rather than an eerie cacophony. Much though I might have liked to spend time studying the plants, doing so while halfway to hypothermia and hanging on with hands growing colder and stiffer was not a good idea. With a half sigh, half grunt of effort I stood and pushed into the greenery. Cold as I was, the water droplets on the plants were still like drops of liquid ice as I brushed against them, but I met with less resistance than I expected. I wondered if the plants were moving aside for me to pass, but then laughed at my silliness. My head emerged into an open space between layers of plants scarcely more than half my height and somewhat wider than tall. A lamp behind me illuminated the space quite brightly. On the lower level of plants grew a few crocuses amidst mixed greenery, while clematis grew across the ceiling of plants. I ought to come here again, and with a dry suit so I can take my time to enjoy this. Well, onward and upward. I lifted my foot onto the trough running just at the level of the greenery and pushed into the ceiling of greenery above me. Just before I closed my eyes to push through, I caught a fleeting glimpse of what seemed to be my left foot plunged into otherwise undisturbed plants. Like the first layer of plants I'd pushed through, there seemed to be much less resistance than I would have expected for the apparent density of plants, and in a moment I was blinking droplets of water from my eyes to find myself in plants up to my chin. This space was much like the first, except here I found tulips rather than crocuses, and a trailer of bindweed gracing the ceiling. Still wondering at what I thought I had seen, I worked my way into a crouching position entirely within the space on this level and looked down. Somehow the plants I had just pushed through looked like they had been growing undisturbed for months. It also seemed noticeably warmer than it had moments ago, and the stone no longer felt quite so chill beneath my fingers. Afraid of how cold this meant I was getting, I pressed upward again. I passed through one more layer graced with jasmine and daylilies before I found myself staring at water flowing out of a hole in the rock wall inches from my face into the seemingly warm stone trough I was hanging onto. At this level there were pink anthuriums growing around me. Above my head was a stone ceiling broken by an iron-bound wood plank trapdoor with a large iron latch set into it. The trapdoor was large enough that it might have been more accurate to say that the door was the ceiling with stonework on the edges to hold the door. Hoya grew out of the water flow and clung to the edges of the ceiling. I reached straight over my head to slide the latch and pushed experimentally on the door. With a touch it silently pulled away from my hand to swing open on well-oiled, perfectly counterweighted hinges. Turning my head to follow the door, I heard the quiet click of the latch to hold the door open engaging when the door had swung just past 90 degrees. After staring in surprise for a few seconds I scrambled into the unlit room above. Chapter 3. It took my eyes a few seconds to adjust to the limited light spilling from the tunnel I had just climbed. Thankfully, I still saw no sign of the spirits as I looked around while my eyes adjusted. Some distance in front of me I could just make out a panel door with a light switch beside it. As I made my way carefully across the shadowed floor I wondered about the costume I would supposedly get if I took this route into the house. I couldn't feel anything different, so I half shrugged to myself and closed my eyes as I flipped the switch. Despite the light in the shaft, the glare of the lights coming on in the room was strong enough that it took me a few seconds to open my eyes. The room revealed by the light was in curious Spartan opulence. Each of the lighter-toned, wood-paneled walls seemed almost to have been cut whole from one enormous tree. The ceiling, of a lighter wood, had a perfectly matched seam running down the center from over the door and looked as though it had been made from two pieces cut from its own tree. The trapdoor through which I had entered was about 10 feet away, set into the center of the darker and somewhat grayer hardwood floor. Here I could readily see the perfect joints by virtue of the differing grain patterns on either side. I moved 5 paces across the barren floor to close the trapdoor, wincing inside at the drips my sodden dress and ballooned diaper were leaving on the beautiful floor. After a moment of looking I found the lever to release the catch on the edge of the door. It swung down with only a light touch to overcome the counterweight and settled into place with the whisper of a perfect joint and quiet click of the latch. In a floor of lesser workmanship the lines of the trapdoor might have gone almost unnoticed, but here, despite all the care that had been put into hiding the door, it was still fairly easy to spot. The entire floor was so perfect that no gap to allow for movement, however small, could be missed, and despite the door having been designed with staggered flooring ends to break up the straight lines of the hinge and strike, the 2 short lines of closely spaced joints were still apparent. I turned from the trapdoor and made my way back to the door leading into the house. Opening it, I found myself looking into the library from behind what I had thought for 7 years was a solid wall of bookshelves. Somehow it seemed I wasn't nearly as cold as I was before, but I still needed to get clean and dry. I left the door open so I would be able to get back in to dry the floor and walked out of the library and up the winding stone stairway to my room. I paused a moment on the landing before opening the door to my room, only to feel liquid dripping down my leg from my diaper. At least the stone would be easy to clean, and take no harm. With a sigh at the annoyance of a diaper full of stream water I opened the door to my room and walked in. For a moment I could just see the night sky through the windows lining the outside of my room before I turned on the light. These modern conveniences really did make things easier, though I knew of the time before only from stories. The light showed the room, a level of the tower ringing the staircase I had climbed. In front of me was the open area of my room with a desk somewhat to the right against the windows. To my left was my private bathroom, a pie shape taking up a quarter of the circle, and behind me where I couldn't see it from this vantage was my bed. The walls were paneled in maple with nice large curtain-covered windows giving a full view of the gardens surrounding the house during the day. The floor was oak laid in a sunray pattern around the room. I turned into the bathroom and stripped off my sodden long-sleeved flower-print sundress and swollen diaper. The bath was tempting, but the room behind the library needed cleaning promptly to keep the water from marring the floor, so I tied a towel around myself like a loincloth to keep from making any more mess to clean up. With just a little water to deal with in most places, the floors were soon clean, and I was pleased to see that the hardwood floor had taken no damage from the water. Thus satisfied, I walked out of the trapdoor room and started to close the door when I thought that figuring out how the latch worked would be a good idea. After a few minutes I was able to find the hidden catch to open it from the library, so I closed the door and returned to my room. Back in my bathroom, I started the water running, took off my temporary diaper, and stepped into the tub to wash the stream water from my hair. A few minutes later, properly clean, I started the tub filling, and stepped out to go rummage through my wardrobe, pausing a moment to add some neroli-scented bubbles to the bath first. Exiting through the door by my bed, I turned left into my wardrobe that occupied the space next to the staircase. In a moment of inspiration to dress up, I selected a long pink long-sleeved dress that would just brush the floor and laid it and the accompanying petticoats out for myself. Even if no one would see me, it was, after all Hallows Eve, and night one should always wear a costume. Returning to the bathroom, I found that the tub was full enough to start enjoying, so I stripped the now damp towel from my waist, glad I had put it on, and tossed it into the basket. With a smile, I stepped into the steaming tub, laid back into the bubbles that came to my neck, and closed my eyes, listening to the gurgle of the water and luxuriating in the rising water and bubbles. Soon I had to stir for a moment to turn off the water, and then I laid back again, resting my arms on the rails now a little below the surface of the water, the bubbles tickling my chin, and the water underneath warming my shoulders. Basking in the warmth, I let myself drift off. I came to again to find the water gone tepid and the bubbles down to numerous patches floating about the surface of the water like miniature icebergs. The effect was quite lovely to see, though I had yet to figure out how the bubble solution seemed to be able to hold itself together like that. I sighed and for a moment considered running more water to heat the bath up again and freshen the bubbles, but then thought I needed to get out of the bath and take care of other things. Slowly I started moving and worked my way up and out of the tub, and wrapped myself in the big fluffy towel to dry off. As I did so, I looked at the dress I had laid out and considered the incongruity of the elegant clothing and my fingers, shriveled as they were by my time in the bath. A far cry from the perfectly smooth lily-white hands of Tail. Well, the former would remain elegant, and a little time would take care of the latter. Suitably dried off, I walked over to my changing table, set out a diaper, and hopped up. In short order I had myself properly diapered and set about working my way into my dress. Help would have made the task easier, but I was lithe and dexterous enough to manage alone. A few minutes later I turned to the mirror to admire myself. The dress was everything I wanted it to be, but my hair needed work. In front of my looking glass with combs again in hand I started working on my hair and considering the possibilities as I did so. In the end I decided on a French braid wound into a bun with the small end in the center and set at the nape of my neck. This done, I looked through my jewelry and considered several pieces before deciding on a flawless cabochon cut rose quartz pendant set in a pale yellow gold filigree. It settled perfectly into the hollow of the scooped neck that almost looked like a slight V, dangling from the thin wheat chain. Turning to the looking glass I stood admiring myself for a while. My fair hair braided back was a far cry from the simple braid starting at the nape of my neck and hanging over one shoulder that I usually wore. Hazel eyes sparkled from under my eyebrows in the light. A pleasant nose, large enough to be a proper nose, yet suitably sized to fit my face. A full, cheerful mouth and round chin completed the lower picture, while my ears stuck from my head ready to catch sounds and bring them into here. Below, the neckline of the dress looked perfect for a princess, and the pendant just above held all the grandeur one could ask. To complete the princess as I thought she should be, I needed only a crown and scepter. While I had the jewelry, the last two items were not to be found in my collection. With a faint frown I turned away and walked down to the library, too busy thinking about what I might do to complete my costume to carry myself with the grace a princess should. At the library I paused with my hand on the door, remembering the costumes stored off the sitting room where small performances could be held. It wouldn't be the proper quality for a princess, but I thought there might be something there that would serve my purposes. With purpose, I walked past the library to a small, unassuming door, my slippers making scarcely a sound on the polished black floor. Inside was an array of costumes and instruments neatly stored. The things I needed were set neatly on a shelf. The crown was a little gaudy, better suited to the crowned king than a princess, but it would work. The scepter, however, was just the right sort of delicate piece I was hoping for. The polished ebony shaft, as long as my forearm and of a size to fit perfectly comfortably in my hand, was capped on the bottom in gold, or far more likely, false gold, and topped with a tiny lotus in the same metal, the outer petals of which overhung the ebony only slightly. A few minutes of looking around showed that the crown would have to do, but at least the scepter was perfect. I opened the case and carefully lifted the crown to my head. As I expected, it was a little too large for my head, but it would work. The scepter, when I took it up, felt like it had been made for my hand. Affecting the proper bearing for a royal princess, I made my stately way back to the library, then passing it by in favor of returning to the looking glass in my chamber to inspect my costume. The view in the glass matched what I had seen before. The crown, with its 5 metal lattice points studded with 2 large glass gems, might have been appropriate for a king or queen, but was a little garish for a princess. Still, it would suffice, and finding the scepter was worth all the effort of the costume. I looked down at the scepter cradled in my arm, and raised it to inspect more closely. If the rod itself wasn't ebony, it was a remarkable fake, right down to the faint hint of very dark brown streaking on the edge. Looking again while considering this and how perfectly it fit me, I had to wonder if the metal was, in fact, real gold. If it wasn't fake, or wasn't by the end of the night, it would surely become my newest wand, and if not, would find itself presented as a template for a wand sooner or later. Raising my eyes to the looking glass again, I held the scepter upright before me and considered the whole picture before me. The crown, resting a little above my eyes, still bothered me, but if I pictured a more decorous crown better sized for my head with 3 shorter, slightly rounded points and a few tasteful jewels, I could consider the rest properly. The dress was as elegant as it was before, and the pendant could even be a keystone. I lifted the crown from my head and placed it on the Milo boy. Without the crown I looked every inch the young sorceress ready for a ball, with perhaps a few tasteful hair decorations. For this night, however, that was a little too close to the truth. A little disappointed, I placed the crown back my head. Now properly armored for the night, I returned to the library. Chapter 4. I paused with my hand resting on the handle of the library door, every sense telling me not to enter. This seemed a little strange, but you either learn to heed those warnings or you won't live to become a sorceress. Somewhat reluctantly, I turned from the library. The call pulled me down the hallway and out onto the veranda before it finally left me. Secure in my costume, I watched the spirits still wandering the earthly plane, milling about. For this one night a year, they were visible and, to a limited degree, able to act on the earthly plane. While watching their visible antics, I adjusted my vision to also show the energy patterns swirling around them. For a moment I just followed the patterns, and then I frowned in concentration. It looked like someone had tangled with one of the spirits. Not a good thing for the person in most cases, as they very often stole things or left hooks leeching from the person. As I studied further, it became more clear what had happened. Whoever it was had been running for the brook, and only been in contact with the spirit for a very brief moment before reaching it, which was a good thing, as the more time the spirit had the more they took, and getting to the water that quickly should have kept any hooks from taking hold. Curious as to what might have happened, I walked over to see more closely. The spirit had apparently taken them fully right at the bank of the brook, but it seemed they had been running flat out, so the spirit wouldn't have had the chance to take them over before momentum carried them into the brook where the spirit could not go. If they were smart, they would then have followed the brook. I looked downstream, then upstream towards the house, but any trail they left had been washed away by the brook. An expert tracker might have been able to see the physical traces left, but that was beyond my skills at any time, much less in this light. With nothing to be certain of there, I turned and followed the trail of footprints faintly glowing in my energy sight. They ended in a slightly brighter glow on one of the chairs at the edge of the pool. Beside the chair was a book dropped half open with some of the pages folded underneath. With an inward wince at the damage to the book, I reached down and picked it up. Chapter 5. Touching the book unlocked the memory that had been hidden from me. For a moment I stood there in shock, and then as I recovered I started to consider what had happened, and what it meant. Just a couple of hours ago, I had come to this world a scant week before as a young adult, a transplant from another world as unknown here as this world was in mine. I'd been told I had the power of a sorceress, but hadn't believed it or seriously attempted to use it. Now, I was a girl not a day older than 5, and a sorceress well in training with power already in my hand of some significance. In addition to losing my years, I had lost my continence. In reminder, the diaper bulged between my legs, bothering me now that I remembered not needing them. The question now at hand was how much of this was the journey into the house, how much was my encounter with the spirit, and what I could do about it. The place I now stood was usually a good place for such magic, but on this night the attempt to find what I was looking for would put me more at risk from the wandering spirits than was wise. I closed my eyes and held the thought of what I needed, letting my power free to show me the right spot. Blind to everything but the call I followed, I soon opened my eyes to find myself standing on the very trapdoor through which I had entered the house after being chased into the brook by the spirits. I drew a circle around me, more out of prudent habit than that it was needed for what I planned. This done, I sat cross-legged on the door in a fluid motion, my skirts forming a puffy ring around me. Even as my skirt settled slowly to the floor, I tuned out the world around me and set to finding answers. I returned to the present from my answer search, and slowly worked my way up from the floor, carefully stretching muscles gone stiff from holding one position for hours. My diaper squished noticeably as I did so, and I thought to go change. Once up, I returned to the library, and found by the grandfather clock there that it was but a half hour until midnight. The spirit had managed to leave a hook in me, and I must act soon to remove it, or I might come be a wraith like him. Despite my now quite wet diaper, horribly unpleasant to the side of me unused to them, I determinedly tried to ignore it and set to figuring out how to be rid of the hook left by the spirit. This night, moon dark and a day of power combined, was a likely night to perform the task. The spell I needed was one I had seen in a book as the young sorceress in training. Thankfully, it was in recent memory, and I was soon able to find the book, and in it, the spell. It was, thankfully, a short spell and easily learned, but it must be cast at midnight on the new moon. This meant I must cast the spell tonight, for I dared not give the spirit a month to leech from me. While I might have managed to deal with it had I been unlucky enough for this night to be just past the new moon, failing to cast the spell at the earliest opportunity was not worth considering. I now stand beside the brook. The nearly leafless trees are scarce discernible under the starlight. My circles are drawn around me, and the hour comes to a close. The spell, or rather 2 spells, are fixed in my mind. Both will free me. The first will return what can be to the way it was before I encountered the spirit. The second, differing only by the final word, will set in place what I am now. Whatever my choice, there is no return. For all my search, I have no way of knowing what was taken by the spirit, and what is the changes wrought by my journey. The former is lost, while the latter I can recover now if I so choose. If I remain as I am, I keep also my memories from before. That would be a mixed blessing, for while I will keep what I was before, I will be a young girl with memories of the ways and pleasures of man and maid, but years before it is appropriate to partake of those games. Just considering it, I feel the desires of the woman warring with the young girl who is repulsed by it. If, on the other hand, I return, I lose all of the young sorceress but for what I remember from this night, and even recollections of what I do not have the knowledge to place will dissipate with time, leaving only the actions I took with no context. In time, I will learn to be a sorceress, and will take the knowing that magic exists with me from tonight, breaking the barrier of disbelief that has held me back this past week. If the spirit has taken either my years or my continence, I will remain without that even if I return, without the compensating gain in the bone-deep understanding of magic that comes of learning from the cradle. The time comes nigh, and the village bell tolls the hour in the distance. I begin to chant, and in a moment I will speak that one word to cast my choice. Even now, I know not whether I will choose the woman or the girl. It was early Christmas morning. My sister Susan and I sat in the sitting room, me in my pajamas and Susan in her nightie. Mother sat by the Christmas tree and handed us our gifts one by one. I was already overwhelmed by all the gifts I'd received so far, and eagerly took the next parcel. "These are from Aunt May," Mum said. We both said, "Thank you," as we read the gift tag before unwrapping them. The moment I saw the fabric I knew something was wrong. "Mum, I think she got the name tags mixed up," I said as I unwrapped the gift further and noticed it was definitely meant for a girl. "This must be Susan's present." "What is it?" "Let me see," Mum replied as I fully unwrapped the dress and held it up. It had everything that a boy hates about girls' clothes: little puffed sleeves with lace edging, a lace-edged collar, a wide ribbon at the waist and tiny white flowers all over its powder blue-colored fabric. I pulled a puke face as I looked to Mother for reassurance, only to see a huge grin sweep her face. Of course she didn't get the tags mixed up. "Yours is obviously the blue one and Susan's is pink," she stated as my head slowly turned towards my sister and the pale pink dress on her lap. "And I can't wait to see you both wearing them," she gushed, clasping her hands. "But this can't be for me, Mum," I pleaded. "It's a dress." "And a very pretty one," she smiled. "And I'm sure Aunt May spent quite a lot of money on it." "But it's horrible," I claimed. "It's nicer than mine," said Susan, adding marginally. "But you're a girl," I replied. "You're supposed to like dresses." "When do I ever wear a dress?" Susan replied. She had me there, she never wears dresses either. I gulped and cast my eyes over my dress with its little puffed sleeves and little lace-trimmed collar. "I hate it," I sulked. "It's the worst present ever." "Me too," my sister agreed. "I can't stand dresses, especially pink ones." "Now stop being so ungrateful, the pair of you," Mum snapped. "What do you think Aunt May would say if she heard you?" I shrugged and glanced at my sister, who wore a similar disappointed expression. "But why did she buy me a dress?" I asked, feeling myself begin to well up. "Probably to match your sister's," Mum replied, glancing at her watch. "Anyway, she'll be here in a couple of hours, so you can ask her yourself, when you're both wearing them." I gulped. "You mean I have to wear it?" "Of course you do," Mother replied as I looked fearfully at the dress. She didn't spend all that money just for them to hang in your wardrobes. My sister and I glanced at each other. The look of dread on her face echoed the fear I felt in my gut. I glanced at my mother, hoping she'd say she was only teasing. There's nothing to worry about, she smiled. You might even like it once it's on. That's what I'm afraid of. Mum grinned at me. It's just a dress, Peter. It won't miraculously turn you into a girl. You'll still be a boy underneath it. But nothing. Now can we stop this complaining please, she asked. It's Christmas Day and you're being very ungrateful. Now unless you show a little more gratitude I'll put your other presents back in the loft, she threatened, looking at the large pile of normal gifts I'd already unwrapped. You can't do that. I snapped. Don't tempt me, Mother replied in her most threatening voice. I looked at my large pile of books and games, model kits and items of boys' clothing. I dreaded the thought of having them all confiscated more than I dreaded wearing a dress. Sorry, I muttered. Good. Mum replied sharply. Now, shall we unwrap the rest of your presents? She gave us each a hard stare, without you two turning into spoilt little brats. I nodded hesitantly. Good. I looked at my sister who smiled back through pursed lips. I guess she empathized as the style of dress was far too girly even for her. Mum turned her attention to the remaining gifts beneath the tree, selected a couple and passed one to each of us. These are from me, she said. I nervously reached out for the gift but Mother pulled it back. What do you say? She asked. Thank you, I replied in unison with my sister before removing the pale pink ribbon and slowly tearing the wrapping paper open. I do hope you like them, said Mum as I pulled away the tissue to reveal a pair of white frilly knickers and a matching vest. Both items had pale blue trim, supposedly to match the dress. Speechless didn't come into it. I croaked, before forcing out the words, thank you. I glanced at my sister who'd unwrapped the same, only hers had pink trim. At least they're not pink. Don't you want to swap? Grinned my sister. I shook my head and looked towards my mother. I wanted to ask her why, but instead, I forced a smile. Are you ready for the next one? She asked, hiding something behind her back. I wasn't but nodded reluctantly. Slowly she revealed two identical gifts wrapped in pale pink paper with a bright pink ribbon. I gulped a thank you before taking the gift. I knew full well it wasn't going to be a normal boy's gift. Thanks, Mum, I said as I feigned interest in the boxed pair of white tights. My sister also thanked our mother, having also unwrapped the same. My stomach turned as I imagined not only having to wear the dress which Aunt May had given me but now having to wear girls' underwear and girls' tights too. My face must have been colorless as I glanced from my mother to my sister and back again. Mum passed us both a sizable box, wrapped in the same pale pink paper, but sporting a big white bow. I pulled at the ribbon and let it drop before slowly attacking the paper. There's nothing more obvious than a showbox, and in light of the current theme of my gifts, I feared the worst as I lifted the lid. Inside was a pair of girls' shoes in the same powder blue as my dress. They had a small heel and were fastened by a simple blue ribbon that tied over the foot. They'll look lovely with your dress. Mum gushed as I removed the tissue. My sister had also unwrapped a similar pair of shoes in pink. I glanced at her as I removed one of mine. Snap, she smiled, removing one of hers. At least yours aren't pink, she added. That was all I could get out as I held one of my new shoes. Why am I getting all this stuff, Mum? I asked mournfully. To wear with your dress. Mum replied, it wouldn't look right if you wore your boy's shoes, would it? She winked at my sister. I was mortified as I stared at the heeled sandal in my hand. I guess not. And it wouldn't feel right without a nice pair of knickers underneath either, Mum added with a smile. I glanced at my sister who was grinning from ear to ear. Stop laughing at me. I snapped. I'm not laughing, she replied, I'm smiling. Why? I asked. Because if she'd bought you boys clothes. I'd have to wear this on my own. She frowned down on her very girly, very frilly, very pink dress. I'd much rather we both wore them than just me. I think if anybody finds out about this, I'm dead. I won't tell anybody, Susan replied. I'm only going to wear it for Aunt May and hopefully I'll never have to wear it again, she admitted before looking guiltily at our mother. They are a bit young for you both, and old-fashioned. Mum said, but then again so is Aunt May, she smiled. Okay, I said as my head sunk into my shoulders. As long as you both promise not to tell anybody. Mum and Susan looked at each other, nodded and smiled before both looking at me. Well, that's sorted then. Mum grinned. Are there any more presents? Susan asked. Let's have a look, shall we? Beneath the tree was still a small pile of gifts, all wrapped in girly wrapping paper. I suspected the worst, but the next gift was worse than that. A small satin handbag, inside which was a hairbrush, a selection of makeup including lipstick and eyeshadow, some perfume, some hair clips and a vanity mirror. Susan had the same but in pink. Next was a large flat box each which was far lighter than I expected, almost weightless in fact. It's from Aunt May too. I gulped having read the label. Susan opened hers before me and exclaimed, oh my God, she held up a voluminous mass of translucent white fabric which floated effortlessly beneath her outstretched hands. What is it? I fearfully asked. It's a petticoat. Mum smiled as her hand disappeared into the numerous folds of floaty fabric. I responded with the blankest of expressions. I'd heard the term before but didn't have any idea what a petticoat actually was, or was for. I began to remove my petticoat from its box. What's a petticoat? I asked slowly as if to delay the answer. Mum took it from me, stood up and held it to her waist. It's to wear under your dress, it holds the skirt out, she replied. She must think we're about 7. Susan stated, clearly shocked. She must think we're both girls. I added dryly. Susan sniggered. Then she made me promise I'd tell none of her friends about this either. Of course, I promised. I don't know if I can take much more of this, I said as Mum passed us both another gift. We're almost done, she smiled. These are from me, she added. We both thanked her before removing the ribbon and paper. A nightie. I frowned. Sorry. I couldn't resist it. Mum said as she watched me unfold the white garment. There's a pair of knickers too, she pointed out, much to my disappointment. It's a baby doll, my sister stated as she unfolded hers. Why are all mine pink? She asked. Mine's got pink on it too, I stated, pointing out the pink trim on the short white nightie. And at least you are a girl. But not one that likes pink, she stated dryly. Wanna swap? No way. I replied, taking tight hold of both my nightie and the matching knickers. This much pink I can just about handle. The final gift was, not surprisingly, wrapped in pink too. Both mine and my sister's were identical in size and shape. The difference was that Susan's fluffy slippers were white with a pink satin bow and mine were baby pink with a white bow. Wanna swap? I suggested. No, she replied instantly and stubbornly. I grinned, knowing full well she wouldn't. I looked up from the nightie on my lap to my mother and asked, why did you buy me a nightie, Mum? You don't expect me to sleep in it, do you? Yes. Susan quickly interjected with a grin. Well, Mum began hesitantly, you've got plenty of gym jams and, knowing Aunt May was buying you both matching dresses, I thought it would be nice if you both had matching nighties as well, she explained cautiously. I know it's a bit girly but, she shrugged, you've got plenty of boy clothes. The odd girl's item won't do any harm. Mum made it all sound innocent enough, but I wasn't convinced by the you've got plenty of boys' clothes excuse. Of course, I've had. I am a boy, and I'll bet any money I'm the only boy I know who's unwrapped a dress, knickers, a petticoat and now a baby doll nightie, but it being Christmas, I felt I had no option but to receive my gifts with good grace. I guess, I replied as I held it against me. It's really short, I observed. Mum grinned. That's why it comes with knickers. Now I want you both to tidy up the wrapping paper, then you can get washed and dressed. Susan and I cleared up the discarded and shredded wrapping paper whilst Mum assembled my dress, underwear, nightie and other girly items into a neat pile on top of the large petticoat box. Keep those ribbons, Mum said. I looked at the bundle of ribbon in my hand and then to the half-filled bin bag. Why? I asked, assuming they'd served their purpose. Because they'll look nice in your hair, Mum said teasingly. You've got to be joking, I replied. Well, they're too good to throw, Mum replied as she took them from me. Moments later, she placed my pile of new clothes in my hands and both my sister and I climbed the stairs. I can't believe this is happening, I said once we'd reached the landing. Well, at least yours isn't pink, Susan said in a mournful voice. And the worst part is. What? I asked. We're going to have to pretend that we really like them. I felt my eyelids drop slowly and steadily as I visualized the scene. Wearing a dress is one thing, saying I love my new dress auntie, thank you so much is another. Like the condemned, my sister and I went to our respective bedrooms and placed our new clothes on our beds. I put my nightie on my pillow and placed the fluffy pink slippers next to my bed. The box which contained the tights I placed to one side. But next was my knickers and vest. These I knew had to go on first, which meant the moment of truth was here. Reluctantly I pulled off my pajama top and, having worked out which was the front thanks to a little blue bow at the center of the scooped neck, pulled on the vest. The silky material fit me snugly and it felt like no item of clothing I'd ever worn before. Next, I slipped out of my pajama bottoms and picked up the knickers. I briefly decided to wear my own underpants instead, but knowing full well Mum would check, I pulled on the knickers. Like the vest, they have pale blue lace trim on every edge and a tiny blue bow stitched at the center of the waistband. And like the vest, they fit very snugly and felt like nothing I'd worn before. The petticoat had no obvious front or back, just an elasticated waistband. I stepped into it and pulled it up to my waist. I looked down and could no longer see my legs or feet for its masses of layers, folds and pleats. It floated around me and caressed my thighs. I knew there and then that this was one garment one could not forget they were wearing. As I unzipped the dress, I figured that it, on its own wouldn't be so bad, it's all the paraphernalia that goes with it. I hesitated before pulling on the dress. The zip is on the back, so how I'm supposed to fasten it I've no idea. Some minutes later, I'd managed to get it no more than a few inches up when I heard a knock on my door. Who is it? It's me, said my sister from behind the door. I need help, she paused, with my zip. I opened my door and Susan stepped in, looking far more embarrassed than I felt. I expected her to burst out laughing at me but she didn't. She fastened up my zip and I asked her why they went up the back instead of up the front. Because otherwise, you'd be able to take it off, she replied as she tied the wide satin sash in a bow behind my back. And when a dress is this bad, she said with conviction, they make sure you can't take it off, she added as I pulled up her zip. So we're both trapped, I asked. Yep, said Susan as she turned to face me. She smiled a reassuring smile before looking me up and down. Peter, you haven't put your tights on. I felt flummoxed. I was going to put them on next. You might find that difficult with your petticoat, Susan replied. She was right of course, so I pulled off my petticoat which let my dress fall to its natural hang, sat on my bed and, being a novice, I followed my sister's instructions. Once my tights were on, I stood up and looked down at myself. How bad do I look? Well, not too bad for a boy. Susan smiled. At least you don't look like a meringue, she added, looking down at herself. You don't look like a boy in a dress either, I said as I pulled on my petticoat and looked down. I still can't believe we have to dress like this all day. And pretend we like it. Susan added. As we entered the sitting room, Mum gasped and bit her bottom lip. Oh, look at you two, she gushed. You look gorgeous. I feel stupid wearing this. Susan stated, sounding completely disheartened. I feel like a girl. I added, equally disheartened. Well, I think you look great in it. How does it feel? Mum asked. I pondered. I swished my hips and looked down at myself. Weird, I replied, turning to my sister. At least I don't look like a meringue. I teased. Mum spent a moment looking at us and grinning like a Cheshire cat. I've got to take a photo. Oh Mum, we moaned in unison. She assured us that she'd show no one as she unzipped her camera case. Oh please Mum, I begged. I think this situation is best kept as a memory, a distant one. I was impressed by my reasoning, but Mum was having none of it. She helped me into my shoes before making my sister and I pose by the tree holding our little satin handbags as she took photo after photo until she was satisfied we looked happy. We spent the next hour or so rummaging through our gifts. I'd been given several model aeroplanes, books and annuals, CDs and DVDs, a couple of video games, some clothes, boys, thankfully, a variety of gadgets and puzzles. Every single one was 100 times more boyish than the gifts I was wearing. I felt out of place reading my Top Gear annual or flicking through the instructions of my model kits. I assembled a Formula One racing car model which required no gluing, and in spite of loving model kits, it just didn't feel right wearing a dress, a petticoat, tights, and heels. Susan, being a girl, was given lots of clothes along with jewelry, a jewelry box, a bead jewelry making kit, more makeup, CDs and DVDs, more clothes, hair accessories, shoes and even more clothes. Mum was getting on with making Christmas dinner. Susan and I did our own thing. We had the TV on with the sound down and listened to my new Slipknot CD, a gift my sister had given me. I glanced around at my myriad of gifts, my white stockinged knees peeping out from my full skirt, the tree, resplendent in festive decor, my sister reading an annual, the satin handbag my aunt had also given me. I picked it up and unfastened the clasp. I looked at myself in the small vanity mirror for a few moments before having a root through the other contents. Do you know what to do with this stuff? I asked as I removed the lipsticks and the perfume. Susan looked over at me. Kind of, but I'm not very good, she replied. Are you going to wear some? I gulped and glanced at myself in the small mirror again. I dunno. Do we have a choice? I asked. Why don't you ask Mum? I thought for a second. Nah, she'll only say yes, I replied as I depressed to the top of the perfume and recoiled as a sweet-smelling mist filled the air and my nostrils. Susan giggled at me. What's it smell like? Girly, I replied before spraying it in her direction. That's quite nice, she said after inhaling the scent. For a girl maybe. I sighed and put the perfume back in my handbag and fastened the clasp with a satisfying click. I ran my fingers over its satin fabric and noticed the light dance off its surface. Just then, Mum entered and asked us if we were okay. I looked up at her, nodded and smiled. It's a nice bag, isn't it? She smiled. I guess. I replied sheepishly. It feels nice, I added, slowly running my thumb across it. Peter's worried that he has to wear makeup too, my sister said with a hint of concern in her voice. Well, I was going to suggest doing something with your hair before Aunt May arrives. Mum replied, so it doesn't look quite so boyish. What do you mean? I asked nervously. Well, there's a selection of clips and slides in your handbag we can try, she suggested. And a touch of makeup wouldn't do any harm. It'll make me look like a girl. You are wearing a dress, my sister stated. A couple of hair clips and some lipstick won't make much difference. 20 minutes later, I held my small vanity mirror in one hand, and a pale pink lipstick in the other. I looked at my reflection. My hair looked shorter yet fuller with loose curls, and these were topped off with a sizable white ribbon tied in a bow on top of my head. Mum had applied my eyeshadow and mascara, and under her expert instruction, I applied my lipstick. Perfect. Mum smiled, before telling to be careful not to touch my face else I'd spoil it. You look really pretty, Peter, my sister smiled. And not just pretty for a boy, really pretty. Will you do my hair and makeup too? Of course, Mum replied. I sat back and watched my mother curl my sister's hair just as she'd done mine. My sister never really went in for any girly stuff either, so it was probably just as a novel for me watching this as it was for her. No sooner had my mother finished doing my Sisson's makeup, my aunt's car pulled up outside. Perfect timing, Mum said as she went to the door. My sister and I prepared ourselves for our aunt's entrance. Before today I was just an average boy and my sister was an average tomboy, but thanks to Aunt May's gifts and our mother's hair and makeup skills, we are for all intents and purposes, a couple of pretty prissy girls, and don't we know it? Aunt May was obviously chuffed to bits we were wearing our dresses and swallowing our pride, thanked her. Well, I can't believe how nice you both look. It's a good job I'd bought you different colors, otherwise, I'd never know which was Peter. You do look pretty, both of you. Thank you, Auntie. I convincingly replied. Mum offered Aunt May a snack and a glass of sherry. She accepted the sherry but declined the snack. Mum told her that I was very surprised when I unwrapped my dress. He thought he'd unwrapped his sister's by mistake, she added. It's an easy mistake to make, Mum, I stated, feeling myself blush. Why did you buy me a dress, Auntie? I sheepishly asked. A broad grin swept her face. Well, I wanted to buy your sister a nice dress because girls should wear dresses. She gave my sister a slightly disapproving glance, before turning back to me, and I bought one for you because there's no good reason why boys shouldn't wear dresses.
Peter's room. It's John. I replied. Is that you, Pete? I asked. My school friend poked his head out from behind the door. My jaw dropped and my eyes grew to the size of saucers as he stepped out to reveal himself. Mum always makes me dress like this at home. Peter meekly told me. That's why I never ask anyone to come round. I tore my eyes from him and panned around his room. Is this all your stuff? I asked. I couldn't think of anything better to say. I don't like any of it. Peter claimed. Mum just buys it for me. I think she wishes I was a girl, he muttered. That's not true, his mother said as she appeared behind me. She must have been listening from the corridor. There's no reason why boys can't wear nice clothes too, she said before asking me if I had any nice clothes at home. I shook my head. Oh, that's a shame, she said. Would you like some? She asked. Not really. I don't think my mum would approve. I stammered. This is a pretty weird exchange by anyone's reckoning, but it got even stranger when she said I'd never know unless I asked. She turned to Peter and suggested he show me his dollies. I don't think he's interested in those, Mum. Peter sheepishly replied as my jaw hit the floor. When he corrected himself and said Mummy, my jaw hit the basement floor. Pete's mother asked if we'd like a drink of juice fetching, but we both declined. She left us alone. Pete looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Sorry, Peter. I wouldn't have called if I'd known. I said, before assuring him that I'd not tell a soul about this. I glanced at his clothes rails and its resplendent display of prissy dresses. The shelf above is home to a handbag, a dummy head with pink bonnet perched on it, various cute cuddly toys and a variety of other girly items. A large book titled My Princess Diary also sits there. Peter himself isn't actually wearing a dress, but he may as well be. On his feet is a pair of pale blue girl's shoes with 2 buckled straps, both decorated with a blue leather bow. He wears a pair of white lace knee socks with frills around their cuffs, and pale blue shorts with no pockets, no button or even a zip fly. His white shirt is clearly a girl's blouse as it has pale blue frilly trim around the collar as well as around the cuffs of its short puffed sleeves. Beneath it I spy the telltale lacy trim of what I assume is a girl's vest. I try not to think about whether he's wearing knickers too. I'd better go, Pete, I said, before once again assuring him that his secret is safe with me. When I arrived home, my mother asked what I'd been up to and said just knocking about. I got bored so I came home. Didn't you call for your friend Peter? She asked, since that's what I said I was doing when I left. I lied and told her he wasn't in before going to my own room. Thank God I don't have Pete's mother, I thought as I entered my own normal bedroom. The next time I saw Peter was on Monday at school. He was very sheepish around me, probably because he thinks I'll have told everyone what I'd witnessed. I thought it best not to mention it as school could be the only time he can be a normal boy. I did tell him that he could call round to my place if he wants. If you're allowed, I said. I might be allowed after school one day, he replied. But I'll have to ask. A few days later, Peter did come round to my house after school. I showed off my collection of Airfix models, my remote control car and various other gadgets. Peter said he used to make Airfix models and also used to have some of the board games as me. We played Escape from Colditz, but didn't finish as Peter's mother came to collect him at 5 p.m. sharp. Mum called us both downstairs and Peter's mother stood in the hallway chatting with my mother. She seems nice enough on the surface, but having seen how she treats her son, all I see is a weird freak of a woman. What have you two been up to? She asks. Oh, that sounds nice. What game were you playing? Escape from Colditz, I replied, before briefly describing the game's premise. You know how I feel about war toys, Peter, his mother said. She turned to my mother and said that she felt that toys such as tanks and guns, soldiers, and swords are unsuitable for children, and as such she'd stopped Peter from playing with them some years ago. My mother agreed in principle, but felt they were harmless enough since children do know the difference between real life and pretending. Yes, of course they do. Peter's mother smiled. I'd just rather buy my children nicer things than toy guns or model tanks, she added. Mum asked after her other children. Peter's the youngest of 3. His big sister Judith is in year 12 and his brother Martin is doing his A-levels. Oh, that's nice, Mum replied. It's just me and John here. Well, he seems like a very nice boy, Peter's mother said as she glanced at me and smiled. Come on, Peter, let's get you home and out of that uniform, she chirped. She seems nice, Mum said after they'd gone. I was tempted to say otherwise and tell her what I know, but I heeded my promise to Peter and half-heartedly agreed with her. She said that you did call round the other day and Peter was in, my mother informed me. Do you want to tell me why you lied? The first thing I did was try to think of a viable excuse, but with nothing forthcoming I told her the truth. He seemed really embarrassed and I promised I wouldn't tell anyone, so I told you he wasn't in, I explained before saying sorry. Well, that's understandable, Mum replied. I suppose it would have been a bit of a shock if you didn't know he was being petticoated. Was what? I asked. Petticoated, I quizzed. You know when you were naughty and I used to make you sit on the naughty step, stop you from watching TV or take away your favorite toy? She asked. I nodded. Well, sometimes when boys are naughty they have to wear girls' clothes and that's called petticoating, she explained. Although there's more to it than that. It was more than just girls' clothes in Peter's room, I replied. He has dolls and cuddly teddy bears, a pink bed, handbags, and headbands. There's even a painting of Tinker Bell on his wall. Mum said that she presumes Peter is not being petticoated because he's naughty, but because he's vulnerable. Sometimes if they're gullible or easily led, petticoating is employed to make sure they don't go off the rails and to stop them getting involved in the wrong crowd. That's really mean, I replied. Especially if he's done nothing wrong. It isn't really, Mum claimed. In fact, it comes highly recommended as a non-confrontational method of discipline because all it involves is a simple change of clothes. Yeah, but they weren't normal girls' clothes, they were really horrible, I said as I visualized the rail in his room. The sorts of dresses that most girls would refuse to wear, all pink and frilly with bows, flowers and, I drew my description to a close with a puke mime. Mum smiled and nodded and said, that's the style they wear when petticoated. It's horrible, I balked. Well, I wouldn't say that, Mum replied. I think too nice is more appropriate, she suggested. Either way, it's not something I want to think about. I glanced at the time and figured Peter would be home by now. I recalled his mother saying let's get you home and out of that uniform and figured he'd be wearing something girly by now, but I didn't want to think about it. I returned to my room and put the Cold It's game away. Peter said he used to have this game as well as some of the same model tanks and planes as me, which means he used to be a normal boy. I wondered what he did when his mother first petticoated him. Was he willing or did he put up a fight? I can't imagine the former, so settled for the latter of the two possibilities, but I didn't want to think about it. A few weeks later, Peter said, "It's my birthday next week and Mum asked if you wanted to come for tea." I told him I'd like to but would have to check with my mother first. "What day?" I asked. "Tuesday," Peter replied. "The 60th, but I'll forewarn you," he added, "I have to wear my party dress." I tried to get out of it but Mum wouldn't budge. He hung his head and I said I hoped I wouldn't have to wear a dress too. "You're not petticoated like me," he replied. I told him that I'd have to check with my mother first. I wasted no time telling my mother that Peter had invited me to his birthday when I arrived home. "I know," Mum replied. "An invitation came through the letterbox this afternoon," she told me. "I assume his mother popped it round," she said as she passed me the card. "Peter warned me that he'll have to wear a dress," I said as I took the card, pink and white striped with a print of a pink satin bow and the words Peter's birthday party written on the front. On the reverse it says you're invited to join us in celebration of Peter's 13th birthday party. The whole thing is pink and girly, even the ornate lettering makes his name look girly. I feel sorry for him. He doesn't have many friends and I guess I really should accept the invitation, but if he'll be wearing one of his prissy dresses, maybe I should decline. I'm not sure if he wants me to go or if his mother told him to invite me," I said. "I got the feeling he'd rather I didn't." "What makes you say that?" Mum asked. "I just think he'd rather keep his friends and his home life separate," I said. "He never invites anyone around and he wasn't happy when I called unannounced that time." I added. "But he has invited you," Mum said. "He might be upset if you don't go, and if he doesn't have many friends it won't be very nice celebrating his birthday alone. If I had to wear a dress on my birthday I think I'd rather celebrate alone," I replied, adding that it would be a pretty weird party with Peter having to wear a dress. "I'd feel out of place." "Not necessarily," Mum replied. "You could show him some solidarity and wear one too." First of all, I flat refused. Secondly, I asked what solidarity meant and thirdly I reminded my mother that I'm not petticoated like Peter. The first thing Mum said was that solidarity means unity and that I should stand by and support my friend. "You may not be petticoated like Peter is, but that's no reason why you can't put yourself out for once," was the second thing she said, and third and finally she asked me how I'd feel if my best friend snubbed me on my birthday. "I'm not snubbing him, Mum," I whined. "I just don't think he wants me to go and I don't really want to go either." Mum gave me one of those looks. "Well, I'm disappointed in you, John. I thought you were a better friend than that," she said. The following day at school, Peter asked me if I'd asked my mum if I could attend his party. Reluctantly I said I had. And, he asked, "Are you coming?" I shrugged and said, "I dunno." I explained that I have a feeling he'd rather I didn't go. Considering how things are for you at home, maybe you'd rather your schoolmates didn't go there. I told him. He rephrased the question and asked if I wanted to go. "I would if you didn't have to wear a dress," I replied. "But my mum's telling me that I should wear one too." I added with great reluctance. "Well, in that case, if I were you I wouldn't go." Peter said, "Dresses are horrible, no one should have to wear them, not even girls." I couldn't help but agree with him, and since so many girls spent most of their time wearing boyish clothes, he's probably right. Thing is, I began, with a trembling voice I told him that my mother had said that if I refused to go, then she's no option but to consider petticoating me. "How long for?" Peter asked. "I dunno, I didn't ask." I replied. "How long have you been petticoated for?" Peter gulped and said, "Since I was 8. 8? I almost yelped. I quickly deducted 8 from his current age of 12 and said, "That's 4 years." "It'll be 5 years next Tuesday," he confessed. "It started on my 8th birthday." Blimey. I couldn't imagine how he must feel having spent 5 long years wearing nothing but girls' clothes. "So the only time you can wear boys' clothes is at school?" I asked. Peter nodded. I gulped and spent a few seconds weighing up my options. "I guess I'd rather wear one for your party than risk having to wear one all the time." That evening, my mother asked me if I'd made my mind up about Peter's party. With great reluctance I told her I'd go and that I'd wear a dress if I have to. A broad grin swept my mother's face. She told me that it can't have been an easy choice to make and said she was proud of me for taking the not-so-easy option. "Well, I'd rather wear one for just one day than have to wear one every day like Peter does," I replied. "So you have taken the easy option?" "Well, I'd hardly call it easy, but it seems easier." On Saturday morning my mother insisted that I have a bath before we go into town. "Why?" I moaned, not wanting to miss any of the Saturday morning TV more than anything. "Because we're going to find you a party dress and you need to be nice and clean," she replied. "Today?" I whined. "Well, when do you suggest?" Mum asked. "Tomorrow when the shops are shut, or Monday whilst you're at school," she suggested. I would have said never, but I've signed up to this and I can tell that my mother isn't going to let me change my mind. I went up to the bathroom and found the bath already full of fragrant bubbles. Of course I complained and said it stank of flowers. "Like I say, I want you nice and clean, not just clean," Mum said. "Now come on, gym jam's off and in," she said as she pushed up her sleeves and dunked a big pink sponge into the water. "I can do it myself," I insisted as my mother appeared to be preparing to give me a bath. My mother said she wanted to make sure that I'm nice and clean, and the minimal fuss method is if she does it. I felt like a little kid as my mother washed and rinsed my hair before scrubbing my arms, shoulders, chest, back and belly with a loofah. Then she stood me up and scrubbed my bits, my bum and my legs. I complained that the loofah was hurting me, but Mum said it's only because I'm not used to having a proper wash. I couldn't wait to hide myself beneath the foam-topped water, where she scrubbed my feet and toes. Mum rooted beneath the bubbles for the big pink sponge and gave it to me. "Here, you sponge yourself off," she said before leaving me alone in the bath. At least the sponge felt a lot nicer than the loofah did. In fact, it was very soothing after the vigorous scrub my mother had given me. I dried myself and got dressed. I noticed that my skin smelled like the bath did and turned my nose up at it. Mum asked if I was ready and I asked if I could watch the rest of the Saturday morning TV show I always watched. "No," was her reply. As she drove us to town I felt more than a hint of defiance growing in my belly. "So what we gonna do?" I grunted. "Go round loads of girls' shops." "Is that what you'd like to do?" Mum asked in a cheerful tone. No. I retorted. Oh. Mum replied, pretending she was disappointed. Well, in that case, you'll be glad to hear that we're going to a petticoating shop, she informed me, adding that only in such a shop would we find some dresses as nice as the ones Peter has. I didn't have anything to say on the matter, apart from blue, when Mum asked me if I preferred pink or blue. She drove into the center of town and right out the other side. Where are we going? I quizzed as we left the town center behind us. That'll take hours. I whined when she told me that we're going to Brighton. Hence me not wanting you spending all morning watching TV. Mum replied. We drove through part of the New Forest, past Southampton and Fareham before taking the slower yet more scenic coastal route. I kept forgetting why just we were going to Brighton and mostly enjoyed the journey. It only really dawned on me after we'd parked the car and found the shop. This'll be it, Mum said, pointing out a very pink shop across the road. Angelic pretty? I read from the sign. I've got a bad feeling about this, I thought as we crossed the road and headed towards it. I recoiled at the dresses in the window. The only other time I've seen such horrendous designs was in Peter's room all those months ago. I can hardly believe that here I am, going to buy something similar so I can attend his birthday party. Inside, the shop stretched much further back than expected and it's laid out in partition sections, making it feel more like lots of little shops rather than one big shop. One section would be all purple and lilac things, another is all white, some have all rabbit, teddy bear or kitten designs and another is dedicated to Hello Kitty stuff. Towards the back is a pink and blue section, which Mum pays more attention to since I'd apparently like a blue dress, but I'm not being very helpful when she tries to find one I like. There's also a completely blue section in which I spot something that doesn't look too bad. It's one of those old-fashioned sailor-style dresses in navy blue with no satin, no frilly stuff and no bows hanging all over it, just some white stripes around its big square sailor-style collar. Well, it's nice, Mum said. And I'm sure it'd look lovely, but it's not really a party dress, is it? I don't know, I replied. I just like it better than all the other stuff in here, I said as I cast my eyes around the items on display. In addition to the prissy dresses were some short suits similar to that Peter wore on the day I visited him. Although absolutely fucking horrible, they too didn't look quite as bad as many of the dresses, so I suggested one of those, but not in a girly color. Again, Mum said they were nice, but for a party I need a party dress. I was surprised at just how big the shop was on the inside, and was doubly surprised when I realized that there's also an upper floor. If the ground floor was scary viewing for a boy, then the upstairs put the fear of God in me. Not only does it have a huge selection of the girliest footwear you've ever seen, it also has underwear and sleepwear too. We had a quick browse upstairs before Mum said that we need to find me a dress before we start choosing underwear and footwear. I don't want underwear, I blurted. Please don't raise your voice to me, John, Mum said. I quietly apologized before quietly telling her that I neither want nor need any of that underwear. If you don't have nice underwear too, you'll only be half-dressed, she told me. I suggested that my own boys' undies would do, but Mum said it most certainly would not do. You need nice underwear, she informed me. Now are you going to help me choose a dress or shall I just choose one for you? I shrugged and said they all looked horrible. Mum asked if that means I want her to choose one for me. Well, I can't choose one. I hate them all, I replied. So long as it's not pink or something, I said. Mum suggested finding me a nice blue one and I agreed, before reminding her about the sailor-style one that looked okay. Nice as it is, it's not really a party dress, she replied. But if you'd really like it, I don't mind buying it as well as a party dress. No, it's okay, I replied. The last thing I want is 2 dresses. We must have spent a whole hour slowly browsing the entire ground floor again. Mum held numerous options against me, which was embarrassing enough, but I almost had a heart attack when she suggested I needed to try one on. Please don't make me try them on, Mum, not here. We need to make sure it fits properly. Mum said, it's a long drive back if it doesn't, she reminded me. Her eyes gazed beyond me and she said, oh, now that one looks nice, as something caught her eye. I turned to see as Mum marched towards it and predictably I claimed it was horrible. It's beautiful, she gushed. And it's blue, you wanted a blue one didn't you, she said as she held it against me. Previous suggestions I dismissed because I didn't like the sash or the short puffy sleeves or the shiny satin fabric, and since this dress has none of those, my mother has deemed it perfect for me. Mum beckoned one of the assistants over and I found myself being briskly led to a changing booth. I barely had chance to protest before my t-shirt was whipped off my back, and finding my pants around my ankles within seconds meant it was far too late to make a run for it. With only my underpants and socks on, the assistant held the dress open for me and my mother told me to raise my arms. I did as I was told and quickly found it floating around me. It's too short. I moaned as my trembling fingertips unwillingly found its hem. Nonsense, my mother said as she stood back and admired me. Turn around and see what you think. I knew there was a big mirror behind me and the last thing I wanted to do was to turn and face it. I felt the assistant's hands on my shoulders and they gently turned me around. My reflection is half legs, half dress, with my gormless face perched on top. I reiterated that it's far too short, but my mother responded by asking the assistant if the same style is available in pink. If you don't stop whining, John, I'll buy you a pink one instead, she threatened. It worked and I stopped whining. Then the assistant said she'd show my mother how it fastened and began rooting up my back, lifting my dress right up as she fastened some straps around my chest. Oh, I see. Mum said in her intrigued voice. That's clever, she added as the assistant explained that the fastening is designed to prevent self-removal. Mum turned me around and smiled as she looked me up and down. She reiterated how beautiful it was as she pointed out the embroidery on the outer layer. Aren't all these little bow motifs sweet, she said. I don't think my mother expected me to offer an answer and she didn't seem to mind when I remained silent. She let go of my dress and said, right, shall we go and find some nice shoes and underwear to go with it? I knew this bit was coming so had resigned myself to the fact we'd be heading back upstairs. What I hadn't expected was not being allowed to put my own clothes on first. Feeling half naked, I trotted through the shop and up the stairs wearing only the dress, my underpants and my socks. The shop wasn't busy but it wasn't empty either and all eyes were on me as I passed them by. The staff smiled, as did the adult customers, but the youngsters who accompanied them looked at me with pitiful eyes. Some, like Peter, are already petticoated. Others, like me, are wearing normal boys' clothes, but also like me, maybe for not much longer. With help from the assistant, Mum chose me the worst pair of knickers I've ever seen. They're white with a huge love heart on the front that's outlined with frilly pale blue lace. The legs and waistband are trimmed with white elastic lace and on the center of the waistband, just above the V of the love heart is a pale blue satin bow. Mum tells me they're gorgeous and takes great delight in showing me the rows of ruffled pale blue lace that cover the bum. Please don't get me those, Mum, I begged. Mum tells me that if I don't like my blue dress, then she can always get me the pink one instead. Which means pink and white knickers just like these ones, she added. I conceded and agreed to sticking with blue. Mum chooses me a little white vest also with pale blue lacy trim which, compared to the knickers, is relatively understated. But things soon got worse as she spent several uncomfortable minutes choosing me a suspender belt. Initially I didn't know what they were for and I wish I hadn't asked. To hold your stockings up, she told me. She found one with satin bows over each of the clips in the same shade of pale blue and heeded the assistant's advice and bought me a pack of 3 pairs of white stockings that consisted of a plain 30 denier pair, a 2 15 denier pairs, one with little love hearts on and one with little bows on, just like those on my dress. In the footwear section she took my socks from me and chose me a suitably prissy pair of shoes, made me try them on. I reluctantly agreed to having the pale blue ballet shoes which also have a bow detail on the toe as I feared I'd only end up with heels if I didn't. I also wanted this ordeal to be over with sooner rather than later, and footwear is the last thing on the list. Or so I thought. No. It turns out that I also need something for my hair and a handbag. Of course I tried to get out of having to have a handbag too, but Mum told me I needed one. What for? I asked. Mum told me it's so I've got something to keep my things in. What things? I whined. When she listed a spare pair of stockings and a clean pair of knickers, a handkerchief and maybe a lipstick and vanity mirror, I reminded her that this is all only for a few hours. I won't need any of that stuff for one party, I claimed. Well, it's better to have and not need than to need and not have, she replied. Choosing my handbag was easy as there was only one that features the same shade of blue as my dress. I recalled seeing a similar one in Peter's bedroom as I tried it on, i.e. slung it over my shoulder and let it hang on my hip. Choosing something for my hair took a lot longer. Mum put numerous headbands, hairbands, hair slides and hair clips on me before settling on a pair of slides with a pale blue satin bow on each. Mum thanked the assistant for their help, before handing over all our purchases. I think John will have the embroidery option too, she said, before taking me and my dress back to the changing room on the ground floor. The only good thing that's happened since I stepped inside this ghastly shop named Angelic Pretty is the fact that my mother let me change back into my own clothes. I carried the big pink branded bags back to the car and a group of kids yelled, "Hey look, he's been to Angelic Pretty, woo-hoo-hoo." They laughed and pointed and teased me. Mum told me to take no notice and told me that they're just the sort of boys who need to be petticoated. I don't think anyone needs it, I said. Especially people like me and Peter who've done nothing wrong. I mumbled as I got in the car. Mum didn't reply to my point, but she did ask if I was hungry and suggested KFC, McDonald's, a pizza maybe, or fish and chips by the sea, she suggested. I was hungry but didn't really have an appetite. My tummy is in knots as I try to come to terms with all the things I've just been bought, and the thought of actually wearing them on Tuesday is something beyond. I wonder if Peter's been to Angelic Pretty and assume that he has. Probably on numerous occasions, I think, as I recall his rail full of dresses. I stare out of the window towards the sea and try to think of other things as we take the slow coastal route back to Fareham. Here, we stop for fish and chips and eat al fresco on a bench overlooking Portsmouth Harbour. Are you looking forward to Peter's party on Tuesday? Mum asked. Not really, I replied. Well, just remember that it's not about you, it's about Peter. It's his birthday, so I want you to be nice, not whine and moan about having to wear a dress the whole time, she advised. Tuesday will be the first time you've had to wear a dress, but if your behavior and attitude is anything other than positive, it certainly won't be the last. Do you understand? She asked. I gulped and said I did. Mum took the big pink carrier bag from me the moment we entered our home. I wasn't sure what she'd done with it but was relieved to find the dress not hanging in my wardrobe or the knickers in my underwear drawer. I didn't see the clothes again until Tuesday afternoon when I arrived home from school and found the dress hanging from my wardrobe door. Its presence stopped me in my tracks and I did nothing but gawp at it for a moment. "I've run you bath, John," Mum chirped as she appeared behind me. Just as she'd done on Saturday, my mother scrubbed me from head to toe with a loofah before letting me sponge myself. I toweled myself dry, wrapped it around me and sauntered slowly to my room. Not only did the dress hang menacingly from my wardrobe door, but my new underwear lay in wait on my bed with my mother hovering over it. "Did you talc?" she asked. "Sorry, what?" I muttered, too preoccupied with the lacy undies on my bed to properly listen. Mum took me back to the bathroom, took my towel from me and made me apply a dusting of fragrant talcum powder with a big fluffy puff, as she called it. Back in my room, she sat me down and rolled the stockings up my legs. As they stretched over my legs, their pattern became apparent. Just like the outer layer on my dress, they're peppered with tiny white bows. She stands me up and pulls them all the way to the tops of my legs, before asking me to pass her my suspender belt. When all these items were purchased, my head was spinning and I didn't really pay heed when Mum told the assistant that John will go for the embroidery option. Now I understand, as in sizable ornate embroidery, in the middle of the large love heart on the front of my knickers is the word John. I gulped but said nothing as I picked up the suspender belt with trembling fingers and passed it to my mother. "Thank you," she chirped before fastening it around my waist and clipping the 4 straps to the tops of my stockings, thus holding them in place. I suggested that maybe a pair of tights would have been easier than all this stockings and suspender faff. "You should have said if you wanted tights instead," Mum replied as she fastened the final suspender clip. "I'm not a mind reader, you know," she added with a smile. With a heavy heart, I picked up the knickers and stepped into them. They looked worse on me than they did on the bed, and with my name elegantly embroidered on the front, there's no denying that they are mine. The gap between the lace-trimmed leg holes and the tops of my stockings is minimal, and the satin bows on the suspender clips only add to just how prissy and sissy my underwear looks. These, along with the bow on the waistband of my knickers, form the 3 corners of a triangle and seem to frame the big frilly love heart, which itself frames my very own name. I bet even girls don't have their name on their knickers. I pull in the little vest and Mum steps back to admire me. "You look so nice in your new undies, it's a shame to cover them up," she said as she took hold of my dress. To be honest, donning the dress and hiding my underwear came as a great relief. My mother told me how nice I look before turning me around and rooting inside my dress for the straps so she could fasten it properly. Since it hangs from my shoulders, I can't see the point of this additional internal fastening around my chest, and being an inquisitive type, I asked about it. "It's to stop you from taking your dress off," Mum told me. "But I'll have to take it off at bedtime," I retort. "You will," Mum replied. "But without my help that won't happen," she added. After slipping my feet into my shoes, my mother slipped the 2 hair slides into my hair and announced that I was almost ready. She removed an item from her pocket and looked me in the eye as she removed its lid and twisted it to reveal a glistening pale pink lipstick. "No, please Mum. Not lipstick too," I begged. My mother smiled and told me that on top of my nice new undies and my pretty blue dress, a little bit of lipstick isn't going to make any difference. "And whilst you're petticoated, you'll call me Mummy, not Mum," she added. "What?" I gasped. "You heard me. Mum said, 'Now what do you call me?' she asked. She asked me several times and issued several threats before I eventually uttered the word Mummy. 'Good boy,' she said. 'Now let's see how this shade looks,' she smiled before showing me how to apply the lipstick. 'That looks lovely,' she gushed. 'Where's your handbag?' 'I don't know,' I muttered. Mum gave me one of those looks, before suggesting a nicer way in which I could reply to her. After several hints, I swallowed my pride and mumbled, 'I don't know, Mummy.' 'Maybe it's in your wardrobe.' 'Maybe it is.' I sheepishly opened its doors and saw the pale blue round leather handbag hanging there. I reluctantly removed it, but noticed something else in there what shouldn't be. 'You seemed so taken by it I just had to buy it for you,' my mother said as I gawped at the navy blue sailor dress. 'What for?' I whined. 'I only need one dress and that's for Peter's party.' 'Like I said, you were so taken by it, I just had to buy it for you,' she reiterated before encouraging me to thank her properly. 'Thank you, Mummy,' I muttered. 'I do hope you're not going to mumble and mutter your words at Peter's house,' she said. 'It doesn't sound very nice when you talk like that,' she added as her eyes dropped to the handbag dangling from my hand. 'Now you'll need your lipstick and the vanity,' Mum said, adding that the vanity is the small mirror I'd just used. 'A spare pair of stockings and a clean pair of knickers,' she added as her hand delved into her pocket, 'and here's a handkerchief for you,' she said, passing me a white cotton hanky trimmed with pale blue lace. After fumbling with the handbag's fastening, I finally got it open. I began putting the lipstick, mirror, and hanky inside, but Mum said I should think about what I'm likely to need. 'I don't know what you mean,' I whined. Mum told me that I wasn't likely to need my clean knickers, so they should go in first, followed by my spare stockings. 'Then you won't have to root for your lipstick and vanity because those will be on top,' she said, before informing me that I'd find my spare stockings and clean knickers in my drawer. I pulled open my drawer and saw several pairs of lacy love heart knickers embroidered with my name laying there. Next to these are the 2 remaining boxes from my variety pack of stockings. I asked which one I should take since one pair is thick and plain, and the other is thin and decorated with love hearts. Whichever you like, my mother advised. I grabbed the thicker plain pair, before reluctantly reaching for the knickers, almost identical to those I'm wearing, only the blue lace trim and satin bow are a darker shade of blue. Beneath these is another pair, the very same style but with yellow trim. And beneath those I spy a tiny hint of pink, but I don't dare delve any further. With my handbag locked and loaded, I hang it across my shoulder and it rests on my hip in the folds of my dress. Mum steps back and looks me up and down. "Oh, you do look lovely, John," my mother gushed. "Peter's going to be so pleased that you decided to wear a dress for his party."